There's a page from a Japanese martial arts magazine, dated October 1974. 2 paragraphs. A wooden sword on a tatami mat. A woman in dark hakama. That's how I want to start, because that's what I have. I want to be honest about that from the beginning. I have a page. 1 page. The page is in front of me as I'm recording this. I had it photocopied from a library archive in Kyoto in 2011, and the photocopy is now folded along 3 creases in yellowing along the edges, and the original page is presumably still somewhere in the archive, in a bound quarterly run that was deposited there sometime in the late 1970s and has, as far as I can tell from the librarian's records, been requested by exactly 2 researchers in the 4 decades since. I was the second. The magazine was a quarterly. It published 4 issues a year, focused on traditional Japanese martial arts, Korea, the older schools, the lineages that predate the Meiji Restoration and that survived, in small numbers, through the 20th century by being passed down inside families or inside small dojos with a handful of students at a time. The magazine's circulation was small. The librarian estimated maybe 3,000 copies per issue at its peak in the mid-70s, dropping to under 1,000 by the time it folded in 1983. It was not a glossy publication. It was printed on cheap paper, in black and white, with photographs that reproduced badly in text that was set in a small dense font that assumed the reader already knew what they were looking at. It was not for tourists. It was not for beginners. It was for a specific, narrow audience of practitioners and historians who cared about the survival of the older schools, and who read the quarterly the way you read a parish newsletter, for the small news, the deaths, the demonstrations, the visits, the things that didn't make it into the larger magazines that covered judo and kendo and the other arts that had become international by the 1970s. The October 1974 issue is 68 pages long. The relevant page is page 53. It sits in a section near the back of the issue called, and I'm translating roughly here, Notes from the Schools, which is exactly what it sounds like. Brief reports. A paragraph here, 2 paragraphs there. A school in Kanazawa held its annual demonstration on such and such a date. A teacher in Nagoya passed away at 84. A small dojo in Kyoto received a foreign visitor in April of 1972, 18 months before this issue went to press, and the foreign visitor, the report says, was Bruce Lee. The report is in 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph is mostly setup. It identifies the school, identifies the woman who ran it, identifies the date. The second paragraph describes what happened. Or rather, it describes what 3 people who were present said happened, and it notes that the 3 accounts disagree on the central question of what the woman did with the sword that was, at the start of the encounter, lying flat on the tatami mat between her and Bruce. I'm going to give you the full text of both paragraphs, in my translation, in Chapter 5. I'm holding it back until then because I want to walk you through the context first, the school, how Bruce ended up there, what the room looked like, before I drop you into the contested middle. The contested middle is the point of the whole story, and I want you to feel it the way the magazine's editors felt it when they made the decision, in the autumn of 1974, to print 3 contradictory accounts side by side rather than picking one. That decision is unusual. Most magazines pick. Most magazines, when given 3 versions of an event, choose the most plausible or the most interesting or the one that comes from the most senior witness, and they run that version, and they file the others. This magazine did not. This magazine ran all 3. The editors, in a 1-line note above the report, said, and again, I'm translating roughly, we present the accounts as we receive them. We do not select among them. That sentence is the reason I have spent the last decade and change trying to find this school. Because when editors make a choice like that, they are telling you something. They are telling you that they could not, in good conscience, choose. They are telling you that the people who gave them the accounts were each credible, each present, each clear in what they remembered, and that the disagreements between the accounts were not the disagreements of bad memory or partial sight but the disagreements of three people who had stood in the same room, watched the same 20 minutes, and walked out with three different understandings of what they had just seen. The editors, faced with that, chose not to pretend they could resolve it. They printed the three accounts and they let the readers sit with the gap. I have sat with the gap for years. I am still sitting with it. I want to bring you into the gap with me, because the gap is, I think, the most interesting thing about this story, and I think the gap is also a window into something about Bruce that the more confident stories don't show you. The confident stories, the ones with single narrators and clean conclusions, give you a Bruce who acts. The gap stories give you a Bruce who is acted upon by witnesses, by their differing eyes, by the fact that what he did in that dojo on that morning was something three people could watch and disagree about. That's a different Bruce. That's Bruce as a thing that is hard to see clearly, even when you are 6 feet away from him and have been training your eyes for years to see exactly the kind of thing he is doing. Let me tell you what the page looks like, physically, because I think you should be able to picture it. It is a single page in a bound quarterly. The page is yellowed more along the edges than in the center, which is normal for cheap paper from the 70s. There are no photographs on the page. The 2 paragraphs of the report sit in the middle of the page, with 3 other unrelated short reports above and below them: a demonstration in Hokkaido, the death of a teacher in Shizuoka, the founding of a study group in Osaka. The Bruce Lee report is the longest of the items on the page, but only barely. It runs maybe 240 Japanese characters across the 2 paragraphs, plus a 1-line editorial note. The whole report would fit on a postcard. I want you to hold that scale in your head. This is not a major publication. This is not a definitive document. This is a back of the quarterly note in a small specialized magazine, written 18 months after the event by, the report doesn't say who, and I have not been able to determine who, written by someone who was either present or who interviewed the 3 witnesses who were present. The report is small in size, small in audience, small in pretension. It is also, as far as I have been able to find, the only contemporaneous written record of this encounter that exists. Nothing in the English language Bruce Lee literature mentions it. Nothing in the standard Japanese kendo or Korea histories mentions it. The encounter exists in this one small report, in this one small magazine, on this one yellowing page that I have folded along 3 creases. That is the source. That is what I have. Everything else in this video is built on top of those 2 paragraphs, plus what I have been able to learn from years of trying to verify them, plus what I think the report was telling its readers between the lines that they would have understood without needing it spelled out, and that I am going to spell out for you because most of you are not Japanese Korea practitioners reading a quarterly in 1974. The school. The woman. The boken on the mat. Let me get to those. The school, the magazine says, was called, and here I have to be careful, because I'm not going to give you the school's name as the magazine printed it, and I want to explain why before I describe what the school was. I am not naming the school for 2 reasons. First, because I have not been able to verify the school's existence in any other source. The standard reference works on Kyoto sword traditions, the multi-volume surveys published in Japanese in the 1980s and 1990s that catalog Korea schools and their lineages, do not include this school under the name the magazine gives. This could mean the school was small enough to escape the surveys, which happens. It could also mean the magazine got the name wrong, which happens. It could also mean the school was a branch or a sublineage of a larger tradition and was known by an internal name that the magazine printed without explaining the relationship, which happens. I do not know which of these is true. Naming the school in this video, given that I cannot confirm the name, would attach a specific identifier to a story I cannot fully verify, and I am not willing to do that. Second, because the woman who ran the school, and this is where the story gets harder, has descendants, possibly, who may still be in Kyoto, who may not want their family name attached to a viral video about Bruce Lee. I have not been able to find these descendants. I have looked. The magazine names the woman, and I have searched the name in Japanese phone records, in Kyoto residency registers, to the limited extent those are accessible, in the obituary archives of Kyoto area newspapers from the 1980s and 90s, and in the membership rolls of the Korea federations that catalog small school lineages. The name appears in none of those. This could mean she had no children, or no children who survived her, or that her family changed names through marriage, or that she was the last of her line, which is, I should note, exactly what the magazine claims she was. The magazine says she was the last instructor of the school's lineage. If that's true, the absence of her name from later records is not surprising. It is, in fact, consistent. But the absence is also not proof, and I am being careful. So I'm going to refer to her, throughout this video, as the woman or the teacher, or, occasionally, by a placeholder I'll explain when I introduce it. I am not naming her on tape. If you go find the magazine, The Issue Exists, page 53 exists, you can read her name yourself. I'm not hiding it. I'm just not amplifying it, because amplification, in 2020-something, is a different thing than printing 2 paragraphs in a quarterly with a circulation of 3,000 in 1974. What I can tell you about the school, from the magazine and from my own attempts at verification. The school was, the magazine says, a small kenjutsu lineage that traced itself to the late Edo period. Late Edo means the 1830s to the 1860s, the last decades before the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which transformed Japan from a feudal society with a samurai class into a modernizing nation-state, and which, in the process, made the wearing of swords by ordinary citizens illegal in 1876. A school founded in the late Edo period was founded in the last generation of swords as weapons. The founders of such schools were men who had worn swords as part of their daily attire, who had trained for the possibility of using them, and whose understanding of swordsmanship was not yet historical or ceremonial. By the time the school's lineage reached the 1970s, of course, this understanding had been transmitted through 4 or 5 generations of teachers who had not, themselves, ever expected to use a sword in earnest. The school had become, like nearly all surviving koryo, a preservation project. The forms were practiced. The lineage was maintained. The teaching went on. But the practical edge had become, by the 1970s, a question of how faithfully one could reproduce the movements the founders had developed for a kind of fight that no one had fought in 100 years. The woman who ran the school in 1972 was, the magazine says, the 7th generation instructor, meaning 7 teachers had held the position before her, going back to the founder. The succession had passed, the magazine says, through the founding family for the first 4 generations, then through a senior student in the 5th generation when the family line ran out, then back to a relative in the 6th generation, and then to her. The magazine does not say how she came to inherit the school. It does not say whether she was related to the 6th generation teacher by blood or by marriage or by adoption being, in Japanese tradition, a common way to perpetuate a school's leadership when no biological heir exists. It just says she was the 7th. She was, the magazine says, the first woman to hold the position. The magazine notes this without emphasis, in the way one might note that someone was left-handed, a fact, included for completeness, not the headline of the report. The magazine does not say how this happened. It does not say whether her predecessor chose her over other candidates because she was the most skilled, or whether she was chosen because no other candidates existed, or whether the question of her gender was one the school had ever considered before she arrived. The magazine, in 1974, was not in the business of explaining things its readers were assumed to be able to read between the lines about. Its readers, in 1974, would have understood that a small Korea school passing its leadership to a woman in the late 1960s or early 1970s, the magazine doesn't say exactly when she inherited, was unusual but not impossible. It was a thing that happened, occasionally, in the small schools that were running out of options for survival. The big schools, the ones with hundreds of students and clear succession plans, did not need to consider women for leadership. The small schools did. The small schools were sometimes down to a single qualified candidate, regardless of gender, and the choice was between continuing under that candidate or letting the lineage die. The school, the magazine says, had at the time of Bruce's visit in April of 1972, and here the report is precise, 11 students. 11. That's the active enrollment of the school the day Bruce walked in. 11 students, plus the teacher. Some of the 11 were full-time, in the sense that they came to the dojo 3 or 4 times a week and had been training for years. Some were part-time, college students mostly, who came when their schedules allowed. The dojo itself was, the magazine implies, not the school's own building. It was a rented room in a larger building that housed several traditional arts at the time, which was a common arrangement for small schools that could not afford their own facilities. The school met on certain mornings and certain evenings. Other mornings and evenings, the room was used by a tea ceremony group and by a calligraphy circle. The school owned its own equipment, bokken, shurnai, training dummies, and stored them in a wooden chest along one wall, which was wheeled out of the way when the room was used by the other groups. This is the school. This is the institution Bruce Lee walked into in April of 1972. It was small. It was poor. It was, by any standard measure, marginal, not in the sense of being illegitimate, because the lineage was real and the practice was rigorous, but in the sense of being one of the dozens of small Kyoto schools that existed in a kind of quiet twilight in the early 1970s, not yet extinct but not exactly thriving, hanging on through the dedication of a handful of students and one teacher who was, by April of 1972, in her early 60s and had been running the school for somewhere between 3 and 7 years. The magazine isn't precise. She was, the magazine notes, 61 years old at the time of the encounter. She had been training since she was 8. She had spent 53 years in the practice of the school's forms. She had inherited the 7th-generation position from a teacher who had been her own instructor for the previous 20 years before his death. She had 11 students. She had no biological children. She had no named successor. She was, in the magazine's framing, and this is important, described as the last. Not the last in the sense that she was certain to die without successors, because that wasn't certain in 1972. She was 61, which was not old, and one of her 11 students might have eventually inherited. She was the last in a more delicate sense, the last of her direct training lineage, the last who had learned the forms from the previous generation in the old way. Before training methods modernized and before the school's surviving practitioners began to absorb influences from kendo and other arts. She was the last carrier of a specific kind of knowing. Whether or not the school survived her in form, the school as she understood it, the school in the way her teacher had transmitted it to her, was going to end with her. She knew this. The magazine implies that she knew it. The magazine implies it without saying it, by including a small detail in the first paragraph that is meant for readers who know how to read it. She had, the magazine says, recently begun to write down the school's forms in a notebook. This is a thing teachers in Korea traditions do, occasionally, when they recognize that the oral and physical transmission may be about to break. They write the forms down as a hedge, as an emergency backup, even though everyone in the tradition knows that written forms are a poor substitute for body-to-body transmission. She had started writing. The notebook is not described in detail. It is mentioned in a single phrase. But that mention, in 1974, would have told a careful reader what state the school was in. The school was in the state where the teacher was beginning to triage. The teacher was beginning to decide what to save and how to save it. The teacher was, in other words, preparing for the end of her own lineage even as she was still teaching it to 11 young people in a rented room. This is the woman Bruce Lee was about to meet. How did Bruce end up at this dojo? This is a question I cannot fully answer, but I can give you the partial answer the magazine gives, plus what I have been able to reconstruct from other sources about Bruce's movements in early 1972. Bruce was in Japan in April of 1972 for reasons related to the production and promotion of his films. The exact dates of the trip are documented in studio paperwork that has been quoted in several biographies. He was in Tokyo for several days in the first week of April. He traveled to other locations during the middle of the month, and he was back in Hong Kong by late April. The Kyoto stop, if you go looking for it in the standard biographies, does not appear. Most of the biographies treat his April 1972 Japan trip as a Tokyo trip with travel days bracketing it. Kyoto is not mentioned. This is consistent with the encounter at the dojo being something Bruce did privately, on a side trip he took for his own reasons, not as part of any production schedule. The magazine says, and this is the only direct claim about how Bruce arrived, that Bruce was brought to the dojo by an introduction. The word the magazine uses, translated literally, is something like with introduction or through introduction, meaning a third party arranged the visit. The magazine does not name the third party. The magazine does not say whether the third party was Japanese or foreign, whether the third party was a martial artist or a businessman or a film industry contact, whether the third party was present at the dojo during the encounter. The magazine simply says Bruce arrived through introduction, which in 1974 Japanese readership context would have been understood as the proper and respectful way for a foreigner to enter a small traditional school. You did not show up at the door of a Korea dojo unannounced. You were introduced. Someone vouched for you. Someone made the call or sent the letter or had the conversation that arranged the visit. That was the protocol. That Bruce arrived through introduction is, in itself, evidence that he understood the protocol and that someone in his network knew it well enough to arrange things the right way. Who was the introducer? I have a guess. I am going to flag it as a guess because I cannot prove it. In the early 1970s, Bruce had, in his orbit, several people who could have arranged a visit like this. He had Japanese students in Los Angeles, a few, not many. He had Japanese contacts in the film industry, particularly through the international film distribution networks that handled his films in Asia. He had at least one acquaintance from his Hong Kong years who had relocated to Osaka in the late 60s and who, by 1972, was running a small import-export business with ties to several traditional arts circles. This last person, whom I am also not naming, because he is, as far as I can determine, also still living, in his 90s now, and has not made himself a public source, is, in my best guess, the most likely introducer. The reasons for this guess are circumstantial. He had the right combination of relationships, he was geographically close enough to Kyoto to make the introduction practical, and he had, by his own past statements and unrelated interviews, occasionally facilitated cross-cultural meetings between foreign martial artists and traditional Japanese teachers. He was, in short, the kind of connector who could have done this. But I cannot prove he did. The magazine doesn't name him. He has never claimed it. I am guessing. What I can say with more confidence is what Bruce was probably looking for when he made the visit. Bruce, in the early 1970s, was deeply interested in the older martial traditions, not just Chinese ones, which were his foundation, but Japanese, Filipino, Korean, anything that he could observe and learn from. His training journals from this period, which have been partially published, contain notes on a range of arts. He was a synthesizer. He was looking for principles, not styles. He visited dojos and gyms and training halls in many cities, often quietly, often without the visit becoming public. The visits were research. The visits were also, sometimes, something more personal. Bruce had a pattern of seeking out specific older teachers, particularly teachers from declining or near-extinct traditions, and asking to observe or briefly train. The pattern is documented in several places. He sought out a particular Filipino Arnis teacher in 1969. He sought out a particular silent practitioner in 1970. He sought out, on at least 2 recorded occasions in 1971 and 72, Japanese teachers from small Koryo lineages. Why? I think, and this is interpretation, not source, I think Bruce was looking for the thing that was about to disappear. He was, in those years, becoming aware of his own visibility as a globalizing force in martial arts. He was about to make the films that would, in the years right after his death, transform martial arts from a regional set of small traditions into a global mass phenomenon. He knew this was coming. He was, I think, aware that the transformation would be expensive, that a lot of small traditions would not survive the global wave, that the standardization that came with international popularity would crush the variety underneath it. And I think he was visiting, when he could, the carriers of those traditions, partly to learn from them, partly to honor them, partly to take a kind of personal inventory of what was about to be lost. The Kyoto teacher fit this pattern. She was the carrier of a small school. She was, in the language of the magazine, the last. She was exactly the kind of person Bruce had been seeking out. Whoever the introducer was, the introducer either knew Bruce well enough to know what he was looking for, or got lucky, or third possibility, the teacher herself had asked to meet Bruce, and the introducer was facilitating her request rather than his. That third possibility is, I think, the most interesting one, and I'm going to come back to it in Chapter 8. The magazine does not say who initiated the meeting. The magazine says Bruce arrived through introduction, but it does not say which direction the request went, Bruce asking to visit, or the teacher asking to receive. Most readers in 1974 would have assumed, by default, that a foreign celebrity asked to visit a Japanese teacher. That was the default direction of such requests. But the magazine, by leaving it unspecified, leaves room for the other direction. And there is one detail later in the report, in the second paragraph, in one of the 3 witness accounts, that suggests the other direction may have been the actual one. I'll get there. For now, hold the question open. Bruce arrived at the dojo, the magazine says, on a morning in mid-April of 1972. The exact date is not given. The day of the week is not given. The weather is not given. The mode of transportation by which Bruce reached the dojo is not given, whether he came in a car, by taxi, on foot from a nearby hotel. None of these details are in the report. The report is interested in the encounter, not the logistics. What the report tells us is that Bruce arrived, that he was admitted, that the 11 students were present, all 11, the report specifies, which is unusual. Normally, on any given morning, only some fraction of a school's students are present, and the report specification that all 11 were there suggests that the visit had been announced in advance and the students had arranged their schedules to be present, and that the encounter took place over a period of approximately 20 minutes inside the dojo's main training room. 20 minutes. The same kind of time frame as the V7 incident on the Warner Brothers lot, although the V7 incident was 4 minutes and this one was 20. 20 minutes is enough time to bow, to introduce, to exchange a few sentences, to demonstrate something briefly, to sit, to consider, to bow again, to leave. 20 minutes is not a long visit. It is also not a short visit. It is the length of a meeting that had a purpose and that fulfilled the purpose without lingering. What happened in those 20 minutes is what the 3 witnesses disagree about. Before I tell you what they disagree about, I want to put you in the room. I want you to see the door, the floor, the way Bruce came in, the way the woman was waiting, the way the 11 students were arranged along the walls. I want you to feel the shape of the encounter before I show you the contested center. So let me take you into the dojo. The dojo was on the 2nd floor of a building the magazine does not describe in detail. What the magazine says is that the room was a standard training space, tatami flooring, wooden walls, a camisa at one end. The camisa is the shrine alcove that sits at the head of a traditional Japanese training hall, and it marks the hierarchy of the room. The teacher sits nearest to the camisa. The most senior students sit closest to the teacher. The most junior students sit farthest away, nearest to the door. This is not negotiable. This is architecture expressing social order. When you enter a dojo, your position in the room is assigned by your rank, and the assignment is not spoken, it is known. You walk in, you know where you belong, and you go there. If you don't know where you belong, that fact is itself information about your status. You are a guest, or you are so new that you have no position yet, and in either case, you wait near the door until someone tells you where to go. Bruce was a guest. Bruce entered, and the magazine says, in the first witness account, Bruce stopped just inside the threshold and waited. I want you to picture this. Bruce Lee, at this point, April 1972, already famous across Asia, already the star of The Big Boss, already filming or about to film Fist of Fury, already a man whose physical reputation preceded him into every room he entered. Bruce Lee stopped at the door and waited to be told where to go. The first witness, who was identified in the magazine only as a senior student, says Bruce bowed at the threshold. A standing bow, not a kneeling bow. The bow was, the first witness says, correct, meaning it was the kind of bow a visitor with knowledge of protocol would perform. Not too deep, not too shallow. Held for the right duration. Eyes down. The first witness noticed this. The first witness says, and I'm paraphrasing the translation, that the visitor's bow indicated familiarity with the etiquette, which was not expected from a foreigner, and which set the tone for what followed. The teacher was already in the room. She was kneeling in seiza, the formal seated position, legs folded under, spine straight, hands on thighs, in front of the camisa. She was wearing a dark hakama over a dark kikaji. The first witness says she had been seated for some time before Bruce arrived. The first witness says the students had arrived first, taken their positions along the walls, and then the teacher had entered last, from a small preparation room behind the camisa, and had taken her position. They had been waiting, in silence, for perhaps 5 minutes before the sound of footsteps on the staircase outside announced that the visitor was approaching. 5 minutes of silence. 11 students along the walls. One teacher in front of the camisa. The room holding its breath. And then footsteps, and then the door sliding open, and then Bruce in the threshold, bowing. The teacher did not rise to greet him. The first witness is clear about this. The teacher remained in seiza. She returned Bruce's bow from her seated position, a small inclination of her upper body, a nod that acknowledged the visitor without breaking her own stillness. Then she spoke. One sentence. The first witness remembers the sentence, but the magazine does not print it. The magazine says only that the teacher indicated a place for the visitor to sit. Bruce sat. Where he sat matters. The first witness says Bruce was directed to a position along the side wall, roughly in the center of the room's length, facing the teacher at a diagonal. This is not the position of a challenger. This is not the position of a student. This is the position of a guest who has come to observe, close enough to see, far enough to not intrude, off-center enough to not be directly opposite the teacher in a way that would imply confrontation. The seating position is a message, and the message is, you are welcome here, you are not part of what happens here, you may watch. Bruce sat in seiza. The first witness notes this too. Bruce did not sit cross-legged, which would have been the relaxed visitor's option. Bruce sat in seiza, which is the formal option, the option that says, I am taking this seriously, I am matching the formality of your space. For a man who was not Japanese and who had no obligation to adopt the formal posture, this was, the first witness implies, another marker of respect. Another signal. Bruce was communicating, through his body, through his choice of posture, that he understood where he was and what kind of room this was. The room settled. Bruce was seated. The students were along the walls. The teacher was in front of the camisa. And between the teacher and Bruce, on the tatami floor, midway between them, the bokken. I want to describe the bokken because it appears in all three witness accounts and because its position on the floor is the thing the three accounts will later disagree about, not about the bokken's initial position, which all three agree on, but about what happens to it. The bokken is a wooden practice sword, roughly the length and weight of a katana but made of dense hardwood, usually red or white oak, and used in Korea training as a substitute for a live blade. It is not padded. It is not flexible. It is a solid piece of wood shaped like a sword, and being struck by one, at speed, will break bones. A bokken is not a toy. A bokken is a weapon made of a different material than steel, but it is still a weapon. People have died from bokken strikes. This is not a prop. The bokken was lying flat on the tatami, oriented roughly parallel to the wall behind the teacher, with the hilt, the tsuka end, pointing toward the teacher's right side and the tip, the kasaki end, pointing toward her left. It was placed deliberately. The placement was not random. In choreo etiquette, the placement of a weapon on the floor between two people has meaning. Different schools interpret the meaning differently, but in general, a weapon lying flat between two parties is a weapon that is not in use and not being offered. It is a presence. It is a statement that this room contains a weapon and that the weapon is known and accounted for. The weapon is not hidden. The weapon is not pretending to not exist. The weapon is there, on the floor, acknowledged. The first witness says Bruce looked at the bokken when he sat down. Looked at it for what the first witness estimates was 2 or 3 seconds. Then Bruce's eyes went to the teacher. The first witness says Bruce's face, during those 2 or 3 seconds, was, and here I'm translating a word that has multiple possible English equivalents, reading. Bruce was reading the bokken's position the way you read a sentence. He was taking in the information the placement was conveying. Whether he read it correctly, whether he understood the specific vocabulary of this specific school's weapon placement etiquette, the first witness doesn't say. But the first witness noticed Bruce looking. The first witness noticed the looking because the looking was skilled. It was the kind of brief, complete scan that people who have been trained to assess a room perform without thinking about it. Bruce's eyes moved across the bokken, registered its weight and shape and position, and moved on. 2 or 3 seconds. Then eyes on the teacher. The teacher spoke again. The second thing she said, the magazine does not quote her directly, was, according to the first witness, something in the nature of a formal greeting. A welcome. An acknowledgement that the visitor had come from far away and that the school was honored to receive him. The first witness says the greeting was brief and that the teacher's voice was soft, not quiet, exactly, but low and controlled, the voice of someone who has spent decades in rooms where projection is unnecessary because the rooms are small and the silence around the voice is absolute. Bruce responded. The first witness says Bruce spoke in English and that the introducer, who was present, the first witness says, standing near the door, translated Bruce's response into Japanese. The response was, the first witness says, also a formal greeting. Bruce thanked the teacher for receiving him. Bruce said something about having heard of the school. The first witness doesn't remember the exact phrasing, but remembers the shape of it, which was, I have heard of your school, I am grateful to be here, I would like to observe if you will permit it. Observe. That word, or whatever word Bruce actually used that was translated into the Japanese equivalent the first witness remembers, is important. Bruce asked to observe. He did not ask to train. He did not ask to spar. He did not ask to be taught. He asked to observe. To watch. To be a guest in the way the seating position had already established he was a guest, present, respectful, not participating. The teacher, according to the first witness, nodded. She said a word or two of consent, yes, you may observe. And then the teacher did something that none of the 3 witnesses expected. She picked up the bokken. Here is where I give you the magazine text. Translated, in full, as closely as I can render it in English while preserving the sentence structures. I want you to have it all before I start separating the 3 accounts, because the magazine presents them together, interwoven, almost, and the interweaving is part of the editorial choice. The first paragraph, translated. The school, name, located in, neighborhood, Kyoto, 7th generation instructor, name, received in April of Showa 47, 1972, a foreign visitor, the martial artist and film actor Bruce Lee, through introduction. The school is a Kenjutsu lineage of the late Edo period, with current enrollment of 11 students. The instructor, aged 61 at the time, has been the school's head since, year omitted in my translation for privacy. The visit lasted approximately 20 minutes in the school's regular training space. The second paragraph, translated. 3 students present during the visit gave accounts. The first account states that the instructor, after exchanging greetings with the visitor, lifted the practice sword from its resting position on the floor and performed a short demonstration of the school's primary kata sequence, approximately 3 minutes in duration, after which she returned the sword to the floor and the visit continued with conversation. The second account states that the instructor lifted the practice sword and extended it toward the visitor, offering it for his examination, and that the visitor accepted the sword briefly before returning it. The third account states that the instructor lifted the practice sword, stepped forward to the center of the room, and performed what the witness describes as an invitation, a single opening movement directed toward the visitor, which the visitor declined by remaining seated and bowing. We present the accounts as we receive them. We do not select among them. That's it. That's the full report. 2 paragraphs. 240-some characters in the original. A world contained in a postcard. Let me separate the 3 accounts now, because they need to be examined one by one, and the differences between them are where the whole meaning of the encounter lives. The first account, the teacher performed a demonstration. She picked up the bokken, she performed a short kata sequence, 3 minutes, maybe 4, and she put the bokken back down. The visit then continued as a conversation. In this version, the encounter is simple and legible. The teacher is showing Bruce what the school does. Bruce is watching, as he asked to. The bokken is a tool of demonstration, not a weapon aimed at anyone. The teacher performs, Bruce observes, conversation follows. This is the polite version. This is the version in which nothing unusual happened. The second account, the teacher offered Bruce the sword. She picked it up and extended it toward him, offering it, physically, across the space between them, and Bruce took it briefly and then returned it. In this version, the encounter is an exchange. The teacher is sharing her weapon with the visitor. She is letting him handle it, feel its weight, examine its construction. This is the generous version. This is the version in which the teacher treats Bruce as a fellow practitioner worthy of handling her school's weapon. This version implies a kind of peer recognition. You are not just a tourist in my space, you are someone who knows what this object is and what it means. The third account, the teacher performed what the witness calls an invitation. She picked up the bokken, stepped forward to the center of the room, and performed a single opening movement directed toward the visitor. Bruce, in this version, did not stand up. Bruce remained seated and bowed. The teacher, the third witness implies, was inviting Bruce to engage. And Bruce, by remaining seated, declined the invitation. The third account is the one that will keep you up at night. Let me be clear about what the third account is claiming. It is claiming that a 61-year-old woman, the 7th-generation head of a Kenjutsu school, holding a weapon she had trained with for 53 years, stepped forward and directed an opening movement, a beginning, a first word in a physical conversation, toward Bruce Lee. And that Bruce, seeing this, understood what was being offered, and chose to stay on the ground. This is not, in the third account, Bruce being challenged. The word the third witness uses is not challenge. The word is something closer to invitation or opening, a word that implies an offered exchange, not a demanded one. The teacher was not attacking Bruce. The teacher was not saying, "Fight me." The teacher was saying, in the third witness's reading, something like, "Would you like to have a conversation in the language I speak best?" And Bruce said no. Or rather, Bruce said no by not standing up. Bruce said no by remaining in seiza, which is the position of non-participation, and by bowing, which is the acknowledgement of what has been offered combined with the declination to accept it. Bruce's body said, "I see what you are offering. I honor it. I will not accept it. I have spent years thinking about why. Why would Bruce Lee, a man who, by every account in every source I have ever read, loved to test himself against skilled practitioners, loved to exchange technique, loved to learn through the body, why would Bruce Lee decline an invitation from a master swordsperson to engage, even briefly, even in the gentlest possible form of exchange? I have theories. I want to give them to you. But first I want to give you the context that makes the third account harder and more interesting than it first appears. The first witness, in the magazine's structure, is presented first. The first witness gives the simplest account, the demonstration account. The teacher picks up the bokken, performs a kata, puts the bokken back down. Simple. Clean. The first witness sees a visit. A nice visit. A demonstration for a guest. I want to ask, what kind of person sees a demonstration where other people see an offering or an invitation? The magazine identifies the first witness only as a senior student. No name. No age given, though senior in choreo contexts typically means someone who has been training for many years and who holds one of the higher ranks within the school's internal hierarchy. A senior student would be, probably, someone in their 20s or 30s who had been at the school for 5 or more years. A senior student would know the forms well. A senior student would, presumably, be able to distinguish between a demonstration kata and something else. So when the first witness says the teacher performed a demonstration, the first witness is making a specific claim, not just that the teacher moved with the bokken, but that the movements the teacher performed were recognizable as the school's primary kata sequence. The first witness is saying, I know what the school's forms look like, and what the teacher did was one of them. This was a kata. This was a set piece. This was choreography, in the sense that choreo kata are choreography, predetermined sequences of movement that have been passed down and practiced in exactly the same form for generations. If the first witness is right, if the teacher was performing a kata, then the encounter is entirely legible within normal choreo protocol. Teachers demonstrate for visitors. This happens. When a guest of sufficient rank or reputation visits a dojo, the teacher will sometimes perform a brief demonstration of the school's forms as a courtesy. It is, in a way, the school introducing itself, saying, through movement rather than words, this is what we do here. This is what we carry, this is what our lineage has produced. It is a gift. It is also, subtly, a credential. The demonstration proves the teacher is real, that the forms exist, that the school is what it claims to be. The demonstration is generous and it is also protective. It says, I am showing you enough to prove my legitimacy. I am not showing you everything. The first witness, in seeing a demonstration, sees a normal visit proceeding normally. Guest arrives. Greetings. Demonstration. Conversation. Guest departs. Nothing unusual. Nothing that needs a magazine report. But there is a magazine report. And the reason there is a magazine report, the reason a quarterly with a circulation of 3,000 bothered to include this visit in its back pages 18 months later, is that not everyone in the room saw what the first witness saw. If the first witness's version were the only version, the visit would not have been reported. It would have been unremarkable. It would have been one of dozens of similar visits to small dojos by notable martial artists in the 1970s. None of which warranted a magazine report because nothing happened in them that exceeded the ordinary protocol. The report exists because the second and third witnesses saw something else. And the editors, receiving all three accounts, understood that the gap between the first account and the third account was wide enough to be noteworthy, wide enough that a careful reader, a reader familiar with what these schools' forms looked like and what an invitation looked like and what the difference was, would want to know about the gap. Here's what I think the first witness missed. I think the first witness was watching the boken. I think the first witness was watching the teacher's technique, the form, the angle of the cuts, the footwork, the things a senior student is trained to watch, because a senior student is always evaluating technique, always studying the teacher's execution for the details that will improve their own. I think the first witness was watching the sword and the body holding the sword, and I think the first witness was not watching the teacher's eyes. The eyes, I think, are where the second and third witnesses saw something different. In Koryo Kenjutsu, the direction of the practitioner's attention, where they look, where their gaze is fixed during a kata, is strictly codified. In a solo kata, the practitioner's gaze is directed at an imaginary opponent, at a fixed point in space, at a target dictated by the choreography. The gaze follows the script. In a paired kata, a kata performed with a partner, the gaze is on the partner. Always on the partner. The gaze is the connection. The gaze is what transforms two people performing predetermined movements into something that resembles an actual exchange. If the teacher was performing a solo kata, a demonstration, her gaze should have been directed at the imaginary opponent the kata prescribed. At a point in space. Not at Bruce. If her gaze was on Bruce, if she was looking at him while she moved, then what she was performing was not a solo demonstration. It was the first half of a paired kata. It was a conversation with one speaker. It was a question waiting for an answer. The first witness, watching the sword, saw a kata. The third witness, watching the eyes, saw an invitation. And the second witness, watching something else entirely, which I'll get to, saw an offering. I don't think any of them are wrong. I think they were watching different parts of the same event, and the event was complex enough, layered enough, intentional enough, that it supported multiple readings simultaneously. I think the teacher was doing something that was, by design, ambiguous. Something that could be read as a demonstration by a student watching technique, and could be read as an invitation by a student watching intention, and could be read as an offering by a student watching something else. I think the ambiguity was the point. I think the teacher was doing something for Bruce, something aimed at him, calibrated for him, and she was doing it in a way that gave him the choice of how to receive it. He could receive it as a demonstration, in which case his response was simply to watch appreciatively, which is what you do when someone demonstrates for you. He could receive it as an offering, in which case his response was to accept the weapon, hold it, feel it, and return it, which is what you do when someone offers you their tool for examination. Or he could receive it as an invitation, in which case his response was to stand up and engage, or to remain seated and decline. Bruce chose the third reading. Bruce chose to see an invitation, and to decline it. I keep coming back to why. Let me save the why for chapters 7 and 8, because the why requires me to talk about the second and third witnesses in more detail, and it requires me to talk about what Bruce might have understood about this woman's situation, about the school, about its fragility, about what it would mean for a man of his visibility to engage with a woman of her obscurity in front of 11 students who were watching everything and would remember everything. The boken was on the mat. The boken was picked up. The boken was, eventually, put back down. Between the picking up and the putting down, 20 minutes. 3 witnesses. 3 versions. One gap that the editors of a quarterly in 1974 chose not to close. The second witness sees an offering. Let me unpack what that means, because the second witness's version sits between the other two in a way that makes it easy to overlook, and I think the second witness is actually the key to understanding the whole encounter. The second witness says the teacher picked up the boken, extended it toward Bruce, and offered it for his examination. Bruce accepted. Bruce held the sword briefly. Bruce returned it. That's the second account, in its entirety, as the magazine presents it. What the magazine does not explain, because its readers in 1974 would not have needed the explanation, is what it means, in a choreo context, for a teacher to offer her weapon to a visitor. This is not a casual gesture. This is not passing someone a tennis racket so they can feel the grip. A weapon in a Koryu school is, in most traditions, semi-sacred. It is the object through which the lineage is transmitted. It is the physical embodiment of the school's knowledge. The teacher's personal weapon, the one she trains with, the one that has absorbed decades of her repetitions and her sweat and her intention, is, in many schools, treated with a reverence that approaches the religious. You do not hand it to someone casually. You do not hand it to someone at all, unless you are making a statement. The statement, when a teacher hands their weapon to a visitor, is one of several things. It can be a gift, here, take this, it is yours now. It can be a transmission, here, I am passing what I carry to you. It can be a test, here, hold this, let me see what you do with it. Or it can be what I think it was in this case, an acknowledgement. Here. Feel this. Know what this is. Know that I have carried it for 53 years. Know that when you hold it, you are holding everything I have ever learned. Know that I am letting you hold it because I believe you are someone who will understand what you are holding. The second witness sees an offering, and the offering is recognition. The teacher is recognizing Bruce. She is saying, through the act of extending the weapon, I know what you are. I know that what you carry in your body is a different lineage than mine, a different tradition, a different set of forms, but I know it is real. I know it is deep. I know it has cost you what mine has cost me. And because I know that, I am willing to let you touch the thing that represents everything I have spent my life carrying. Bruce accepted. The second witness says Bruce accepted. I want to think about what Bruce accepting means. Bruce, in Saiza, receiving a wooden sword from a 61-year-old woman in a small Kyoto dojo, what is that? Bruce was not a swordsman. Bruce's training was in striking arts, in grappling arts, in the unarmed traditions of southern China and the Philippines and whatever else he had synthesized by 1972. Bruce did not carry a weapon. Bruce's weapon was his body. For Bruce to accept a sword, to hold it, even briefly, is for Bruce to hold someone else's language in his hands. It is for Bruce to say, through the acceptance, I do not speak your language, but I am willing to hold it. I am willing to feel its weight. I am willing to know, through my hands, what your life has been about. The second witness says Bruce held the sword briefly. Briefly, the magazine doesn't say how long. 5 seconds? 30 seconds? A minute? Briefly. And then Bruce returned it. I imagine Bruce holding the bokken. I imagine him feeling the weight. A good bokken weighs about 500 to 600 grams, depending on the wood, a little over a pound, and I imagine him feeling the balance point, which in a well-made bokken sits about a third of the way from the hilt, and I imagine him feeling the wear on the handle where 53 years of grip have smoothed the wood to a particular texture that no new bokken has. I imagine him feeling, through his hands, the history of the object. Bruce had trained hands. Bruce's hands were, by every account, extraordinarily sensitive instruments. He could feel things through contact that other people couldn't. He could feel tension, resistance, direction, intention. If he held that bokken for even 5 seconds, he felt the woman's life in it. He felt the lineage in it. He felt the weight of what she was offering him to hold. And then he gave it back. The returning is the part the second witness emphasizes. The second witness says Bruce returned the sword, and the word the magazine uses for the returning implies formality. It implies that Bruce did not simply hand the bokken back but returned it in a way that honored what it was. There is a way to return a weapon in a dojo that says thank you for letting me hold this. There is a way that says I have felt what you wanted me to feel. There is a way that says I am giving this back to you because it belongs to you and not to me, and I know that. The second witness saw, in the returning, something that mattered. Now, here is the tension between the second and third accounts. The second witness says Bruce accepted the sword and held it. The third witness says Bruce remained seated and bowed, declined the invitation. These two accounts appear, on the surface, to be contradictory. In one, Bruce takes the weapon. In the other, Bruce stays on the ground and does not engage. But I don't think they are describing different moments. I think they are describing the same sequence from two different angles of understanding. And the sequence, I think, is this. The teacher picks up the bokken. She performs the movement, the kata, the invitation, whatever it was. She then extends the weapon toward Bruce. Bruce, still in seiza, or perhaps having shifted forward slightly, accepts the weapon. He holds it. He feels it. He returns it. And then, or perhaps simultaneously with the returning, he bows. He remains seated. He does not stand. He does not engage. The second witness sees the middle of this sequence, the offering, the holding, the returning. The third witness sees the end of this sequence, the bow, the remaining seated, the refusal to stand and engage despite having been invited. The first witness sees the beginning, the movement with the sword that preceded the offering. 3 witnesses. 3 windows into one continuous event. None of them wrong. All of them partial. The magazine's editors, I think, understood this. I think the editors received 3 accounts that each described a portion of a single 20-minute encounter, and the editors understood that the accounts were not contradictory but sequential, and yet the editors chose to present them as 3 parallel alternatives rather than assembling them into a single narrative. Why? Because assembly would have required interpretation. Assembly would have required the editors to decide what order the moments went in, what caused what was response and what was initiation. Assembly would have required the editors to build a story, and the editors, in that one-line note, said explicitly that they were not selecting among the accounts. They were not building a story. They were presenting raw testimony and leaving the reader to do the work. I am doing the work now, 50 years later, in a language the magazine was not written in, for an audience the magazine's editors could not have imagined. I am assembling the 3 accounts into a sequence because I think the sequence is what happened and because the sequence makes sense of things the parallel versions cannot. But I want to be clear that the assembly is mine. The editors did not do it. The magazine does not authorize it. I am interpreting. I am building a reading. And the reading could be wrong. The reading is, the teacher performed a movement with the sword. The movement was simultaneously a demonstration, an invitation, and a prelude to an offering. Bruce watched the movement and understood, through the teacher's eyes, through the direction of her gaze, through whatever communication was passing between them in those moments, that the movement was aimed at him. The teacher then extended the sword. Bruce accepted it, held it, returned it. In returning it, Bruce bowed. In bowing, Bruce declined to stand. In declining to stand, Bruce declined to engage further. The encounter then continued as conversation, quiet, formal, translated through the introducer, for whatever remained of the 20 minutes. That's my reading. That's the sequence I've assembled. I could be wrong. The accounts might genuinely describe 3 different moments that happened in a different order, or 3 different encounters that the witnesses have conflated, or something else entirely that I cannot see from this distance. But the reading I've given you is the one that makes the most sense to me, and it's the one I'm going to work from for the next 2 chapters. Let me talk about the third witness now, and let me talk about why Bruce stayed on the ground. The third witness sees an invitation declined. The third witness is, I think, the youngest of the 3. The magazine doesn't say this directly, but the third witness's account has a quality of surprise that the other 2 don't have, and surprise, in my experience, is the province of the young. The senior student, the first witness, sees a demonstration and is not surprised by it, because demonstrations are normal protocol. The second witness sees an offering and recognizes it, which requires enough experience to know what offerings look like. The third witness sees an invitation and is shocked by it, shocked enough that what they remember most clearly is not what the teacher did but what Bruce did not do. The third witness remembers Bruce staying seated. The third witness remembers the bow. The third witness remembers the teacher stepping forward with the bokken and Bruce not rising to meet her. The shock is in the not rising. The third witness, I think, expected Bruce to stand. The third witness had heard enough about Bruce Lee. By April 1972, in Japan, you had heard of Bruce Lee if you were a martial arts student, his films were circulating, his reputation was growing. The third witness had heard enough to expect that if someone offered Bruce Lee a physical conversation, Bruce Lee would accept. Bruce Lee was the man who always accepted. Bruce Lee was the man who tested himself against everyone. Bruce Lee was the man who, in the stories that were already circulating in martial arts circles by 72, never turned down a challenge, never declined an exchange, never passed up the opportunity to learn through his body what another person's art felt like from the inside. And Bruce stayed on the ground. I think this shocked the third witness because the third witness was young enough to believe the stories. The third witness was young enough to think that Bruce Lee's reputation, the always accepting, always engaging, always testing reputation, was the whole truth. The third witness did not yet know that a reputation is a simplified version of a person, and that a person has reasons for declining that a reputation cannot contain. Why did Bruce stay seated? I have 3 theories. I'm going to give you all 3, and I'm going to tell you which one I believe and why. Theory 1, Bruce stayed seated because he didn't know what was being offered. He misread the situation. He thought the teacher was performing a demonstration, the first witness's version, and he responded as a guest watching a demonstration responds, which is to sit still and watch. In this theory, Bruce's bow at the end was a thank you for showing me bow, not a decline the invitation bow. In this theory, there is no invitation to decline because Bruce didn't perceive one. The third witness projected an invitation onto the teacher's movement, and Bruce, not sharing that projection, simply sat and watched. I don't believe this theory. I don't believe it because everything I know about Bruce Lee's ability to read a room, read a body, read intention, everything from every source, every story, every training partner who ever described working with him tells me that Bruce did not misread physical intention. Bruce's entire system was built on reading. On seeing what was coming before it came. On detecting intention in the first microsecond of movement and responding to the intention rather than to the completed action. If the teacher directed an opening movement toward him, if her eyes were on him, if her weight shifted in his direction, if the sword's arc included him in its trajectory, Bruce read it. Bruce knew. Bruce understood exactly what was being offered. Theory 2, Bruce stayed seated because he was afraid. He recognized the teacher's skill in her movement, in the quality of her form, in whatever his trained eyes could see that the third witness's untrained eyes could not, and he assessed that engaging with her, even in a controlled exchange, carried a risk he was not willing to take. In this theory, Bruce's bow is a survival response. He sees something dangerous and he chooses not to engage with it. He protects himself by declining. I don't believe this theory either. Not because I think Bruce was incapable of fear, he was human, he knew danger, but because the math doesn't work. Bruce was 31. He was at the absolute peak of his physical abilities. The teacher was 61. She had been training for 53 years, and that training was real and deep and should not be underestimated, but she was 61, and the bokken in her hands was made of wood, not steel, and the exchange being offered was a controlled one with 11 witnesses in a small room. The physical risk to Bruce was minimal. Whatever the teacher could do with a bokken, and I'm sure she could do remarkable things, Bruce was faster, younger, and operating in a context where the exchange would have been governed by the decorum of the dojo. This was not a back alley ambush. This was a formal invitation in a formal space. Bruce was not in danger. Theory 3, Bruce stayed seated because standing up would have been wrong. Not wrong in the sense of tactically wrong. Wrong in the sense of ethically wrong. Wrong in the sense that Bruce understood something about this woman's situation, about the school, about its fragility, about what it would mean, and he made a decision that honored that understanding rather than his own desire to engage. This is the theory I believe. Let me explain why. The teacher was the last. The magazine says so. The teacher was 61, with no named successor, running a school of 11 students in a rented room, writing her forms in a notebook as a hedge against the lineage's extinction. The teacher was, in the language I used in Chapter 2, in twilight. She was carrying something that was about to end, and she knew it, and the quarterly's readers knew it, and anyone who walked into that dojo with even a basic understanding of Korea demographics in the early 1970s would have known it. Bruce knew it. Bruce knew it because whoever introduced him had told him what the school was. Bruce knew it because he had been seeking out exactly these kinds of schools, the twilight schools, the last carrier schools, the schools that were one death away from extinction. Bruce had come to observe, and in coming to observe, he had come with respect for what he was observing, and that respect included an awareness of the school's position. Now imagine Bruce standing up. Imagine Bruce accepting the invitation. Imagine Bruce, 31, fast, famous, physically extraordinary, engaging with a 61-year-old woman in front of her 11 students. What happens? If Bruce engages gently, if he moves at half speed, if he softens his responses, if he meets her invitation with a carefully calibrated restraint, then the 11 students see their teacher exchanging with a man who is not trying. They see their teacher being patronized. They see a famous martial artist humoring an old woman in a way that diminishes her. And they carry that image with them for the rest of their lives, the image of their teacher being treated with the careful condescension of someone who could have done more and chose not to. If Bruce engages fully, if he meets her at his actual speed, at his actual intensity, with the full weight of what he is, then the 11 students see their teacher outmatched. They see her, at 61, unable to keep up with a 31-year-old man at the peak of his powers. And they carry that image instead, the image of their teacher being exposed, being shown the gap between what she carries and what a younger, faster body can do. Either way, Bruce standing up damages the teacher in front of her students. Either way, the 11 people in that room walk out with a story that diminishes her. Either way, the school, already fragile, already in twilight, takes a blow to the thing that holds it together, which is the students' faith in their teacher's authority. Bruce stayed on the ground. Bruce stayed on the ground because standing up would have cost the teacher something she could not afford to lose. Bruce stayed on the ground because the refusal to engage was, in this specific context, the highest form of respect he could offer. Bruce stayed on the ground because he understood that his body, his speed, his youth, his fame was, in this room, a weapon he did not have the right to use. The bokken on the mat was one weapon. Bruce's body was another. And just as the teacher had placed the bokken on the mat at the start, acknowledged, visible, not in use, Bruce kept his own weapon where it was. On the ground. Acknowledged. Not deployed. The bow was not a refusal. The bow was a mirror. The teacher had placed her weapon on the mat at the beginning. Bruce, by remaining seated and bowing, placed his weapon on the mat at the end. Both of them, by the time the 20 minutes were over, had weapons that were not drawn. This is, and I want to be careful, because I know I'm building interpretation on top of interpretation here, this is what I think the teacher was testing. Not Bruce's skill. Not his speed. Not whether he could handle a bokken or meet a sword form. She was testing whether he knew when not to act. Whether the man whose reputation was built on action, on speed, on intervention, on meeting every challenge, had the other thing. The thing that is harder than action. The thing that requires more discipline than fighting. The thing that traditional martial arts, at their deepest, are supposed to teach, restraint. The knowledge of when not to move. The wisdom of the weapon that stays on the mat. Bruce passed the test. By not moving, he passed. And the teacher, I imagine, though the magazine doesn't say, put the bokken back down. And the visit continued as conversation. And something was understood between them that the three witnesses saw in three different ways, because what was understood was not visible on the surface. It was underneath. It was in the decision Bruce made and the reason he made it, and the teacher's recognition that he had made it for the right reason. The bokken was on the mat. It stayed there. That's the story. The magazine says she was the last. The magazine, in October of 1974, describes the teacher as the last instructor of her school's lineage. This is, I want to note, an assessment made by the magazine's editors or by their source. It is not a quote from the teacher herself. The teacher, in the report, does not call herself the last of anything. The teacher does not speak at all in the report, except through the filter of what the first witness remembers her saying to Bruce: greetings, a direction to sit, consent to observe. The teacher's voice, in the magazine, is almost entirely absent. She is described. She is not quoted. She acts, picks up the sword, extends it, puts it down, but she does not speak in her own voice about what she is doing or why. The last label is the magazine's. And I want to ask, was it true? I have spent, as I said at the beginning, years trying to verify this school's existence and this woman's identity. And what I have found is essentially nothing. The school, under the name the magazine gives, does not appear in any other source I have located. The woman, under the name the magazine gives, does not appear in any other source I have located. The dojo building, in the neighborhood the magazine identifies, has been rebuilt at least once in the intervening decades, and no current tenant or building manager has any knowledge of a kenjutsu school having operated there in the 1970s. Does this mean the school didn't exist? No. It means the school was small. It means the school was exactly what the magazine says it was: a marginal lineage, a handful of students, a rented room. The kind of school that leaves no trace when it ends. The kind of school that exists in the bodies of its practitioners and in the memories of anyone who happened to walk through the door, and that, when the last body stops practicing and the last memory fades, simply ceases to have ever been. I think the school ended. I think the teacher died probably in the 1980s or early 1990s, given that she was 61 and 72, and I think no one inherited. I think the 11 students dispersed. Some of them may have continued practicing the forms on their own. Some of them may have joined other schools. Some of them may have, like the teacher, begun writing things down in notebooks that exist somewhere in Kyoto in boxes and drawers in attics. But the school as an institution, as a dojo with a teacher and students and a weekly schedule and a chest of equipment along the wall, I think the school ended. The teacher was the last. The magazine was right. And Bruce, in April of 1972, 20 months before his own death, sat in that room and knew he was looking at something that was about to end. He was looking at a woman carrying a weight that nobody was going to take from her. He was looking at a lineage in its final form. He was looking at a school that existed in one body and that, when that body stopped, would stop. And he stayed on the ground. He did not ask her to prove herself. He did not test her. He did not, by engaging, create a story in which she was measured against him and found to be anything other than what she was, a master at the end of her line, carrying a tradition she could not pass on, performing for one visitor what she had spent 53 years learning to perform for no one. The bokken was on the mat. It stayed there. Bruce went back to Hong Kong. 20 months later he was dead. I wonder, sometimes, whether the teacher heard about Bruce's death. In July of 1973, when the news came, when the news went around the world, when every martial arts community in every country registered the shock of it, I wonder if the teacher, in her small dojo in Kyoto, heard the news and thought about the morning in April when a young man had sat on her floor and held her sword and given it back and bowed and not stood up. I wonder if she understood, retroactively, what that visit had meant, that Bruce had come to her the way you visit a shrine before it closes, the way you pay respects to something you know you will not see again. I wonder if she recognized, in the news of his death, that they had both been in twilight that morning. That he was 20 months from the end of his life and she was perhaps a decade or two from the end of her lineage, and that the visit, the 20 quiet minutes in the small room, had been two endings sitting together, each recognizing the other. I don't know. The magazine doesn't say. The teacher's voice is not in the record. Whatever she thought about Bruce's death, whatever she thought about the visit in retrospect, whatever she thought about the 3 witness accounts when the magazine published them 18 months after the event, if she saw them, if someone showed her, if she even knew the quarterly existed, she kept it to herself. Like the bodyguard in the last video, she is a silence in the story. A central silence. The person around whom everything turns, who never turns toward us. There's a thing I want to tell you about another school, a different school, on a different island, in a different tradition. A school I have heard about from a single source, a source I haven't been able to verify yet. A school that Bruce may have tried to visit in the last year of his life and that he may not have reached because the letter he sent, if he sent a letter, may not have arrived before he died. That school, if it existed, if the letter existed, if any of this is verifiable, is a story I'm still working on. I'm still trying to find the letter. I'm still trying to find someone who knew the school's teacher. When I have more, I'll bring it to you. For now, it's a thread. A loose end. A possibility that sits at the edge of what I know and that I'm not willing to assert until I've done more work. But I mention it because it suggests something about the pattern of Bruce's last years, the pattern of seeking out the carriers of dying traditions, the pattern of visiting, observing, honoring, not engaging. The Kyoto visit fits the pattern. The possible letter to the other school fits the pattern. Bruce, in the last 2 years of his life, was doing something. He was building something, not a system, not a curriculum, but a kind of personal archive. A collection of encounters. A set of things he had seen and felt and held that he carried in his body the way the teacher carried her forms in hers. Bruce was becoming, I think, his own kind of lineage holder. Not of one school but of the experience of witnessing many schools in their final forms. And then he died. And whatever he had collected, the visits, the observations, the 20-minute encounters in small rooms, died with him. In the same way the teacher's school would later die with her. 2 carriers. 2 endings. One morning in Kyoto when both of them were still alive and the bokken was still on the mat and the silence in the room was full of things neither of them needed to say out loud. The cup was warm in V7. The bokken was on the mat in V8. Both stories end the same way, with something undisturbed. With the evidence that what happened happened gently enough that the world around it didn't move. The coffee stayed warm. The sword stayed down. The violence that could have happened chose not to happen, and the choosing was the whole point. That's the story. The bokken on the mat. 2 paragraphs in a quarterly. 3 witnesses who saw 3 different things. A woman whose name I'm not saying. A school that no longer exists. A visit that lasted 20 minutes and that took me 10 years to find and that I still, after everything, cannot fully verify. I've given you what I have. I've told you where the gaps are. I've told you what I think and I've told you where the thinking breaks down. The page is in front of me. The page is yellowed. The page is real. What it describes, I believe it happened. I believe Bruce sat in that room and held that sword and gave it back and did not stand. I believe the teacher knew what she was doing when she picked up the bokken. I believe the 11 students saw what they saw and that none of them were wrong. The bokken was on the mat. It stayed there. That's all I have. Thank you for listening.